In this video, we're going to walk through some code that I've written to determine the winner of an election in a plurality voting system. And hopefully you can use some of the ideas in this video to help you write a program that will determine the winner of an election via word account method. Now, some of this I'm not going to go over in great detail because we did this in class. And in particular, I'm talking about the read phase that I have highlighted right here on the screen. The read phase of our program is where we open up our file and read in the contents of that file and then format the contents of that file appropriately for our particular purpose. What you'll see right here is that we open the file, we remove any type of spaces, tabs, or new line characters that might be sitting at the end of each line, and then we have a little helper function defined up here at the top. What this does is it takes in a line from that file and splits it up into a list of individual strings, but really each string is actually a numeric value, and so we then convert each string into an integer value and return this list of integer values. So when all is said and done, if we go ahead and add in a print statement here and ask the program to print that votes object for us, we'll see a little bit more specifically what it looks like. The votes object itself is a big list, and each element in the list is the list of integers. And this list of integers has a correspondence to the candidates in the election and the voter's preference for them. So a number of 6 that we would see in any given voter profile is indicating that the candidate that's associated with that position would be their favorite candidate, whereas 0 would be their least favorite candidate. I now want to move on to the evaluate portion of this program. The very first thing that I've done is I've created a string called candidates that's just going to provide a very simple name for the candidate in position 0, the candidate in position 1, the candidate in position 2, and so on. And so we'll have that the 0th candidate is candidate A, the first candidate is candidate B, and so on. So this thing called candidates right here is just creating an alias for the 0th candidate, first candidate, second candidate, and so on, to be a little bit more like an example we would do in real life. The only other thing that we see here in the evaluate phase is that I've created an object called winner, and winner is what we're going to put as the output of this plurality function, which takes in the argument votes. And so in order to figure out more specifically what's happening in this evaluate phase, we need to go and take a look at the definition of the plurality function. And up here on line 11 is where we define that plurality function. And you can see that the parameter of the plurality function is something called big list, or perhaps it would have been better to call it something like list of lists. And what is being passed to the plurality function as a parameter is this thing votes that we can see the output over here in the black console window. Now if we look at line 12, you can see that we are declaring a variable that we call letters, and we're assigning it a value. And it's written in this list comprehension format, where the objects that are populating the list are the output of the candidate function, where this candidate function seems to take in one parameter. We're passing it the argument voter for each voter in the big list. So over here on the right, we can see our big list, and we can see what the items in that big list look like. They themselves are lists. So this voter object is a list object, and it is being passed to the candidate function. And then we're storing the outputs of that candidate function in a large list, and then we're calling that thing letters. So as soon as we call the plurality function on line 31 of this program, right down here, that immediately jumps and brings our flow of control up to line 11 here into the plurality function. Our very first line of that function is to create this letters object, and in order to create this letters object, we will need to repeatedly call the candidate function. We'll be calling it as many times as we have elements in the big list, once for each voter profile. So let's go take a look at that helper function. It's a pretty small function. And its only purpose at this point is to really help us simplify the plurality function, so that's why I call it a helper function. We can see that this candidate function takes in one argument that is named myList and is in fact a list object. Remember, what's going to be passed there is an individual voter profile. And there are just 3 lines of code here. What line 7 does is it determines the biggest element in the list. That is, the highest ranking candidate. Because we're working with a very specific example here, we can see that 6 is going to be that biggest number for this specific example, but we've written the program more generally so that if we had a different type of input file and we didn't know that 6 was the largest number ahead of time, we'd still be able to identify what that is. What line 8 does is it says, okay, so in this example, 6 is this biggest value. Where in the list does the number 6 occur? So it asks the myList object for the index that corresponds to that biggest number. So let's work with a specific example here, and let's work with this second voter profile, this one that I've highlighted right here. At line 7, we're going to find the largest item in that list, and for us, that's going to be the value of 6. In line 8, what we're going to do is determine where in the list that number 6 occurs. And in this example that we have highlighted over here, that 6 occurs in the 0, 1, 2 position. And what we're going to return is the thing called candidates, plural, at that particular position. Now, candidates, plural, is not a variable that's been defined in the body of this function. So the very next place that the candidate function would go to look for the candidates object is back to the function that called it. The plurality function is what called the candidate function, and it does not have an object called candidates that is declared within the body of that function either. Candidates is used on line 15, but it's not defined there. So at that point, the candidate function will search out into the global scope of the program, right back here to line 30, and identify this declaration of the variable candidates as this particular string. So that's what the candidates object is in the mind of our candidate function. And what we're returning then is the value in the candidate's string at the position from the line above. So to make it simpler, I've written down on line 9 what the candidate's object is so that we can count into the 0, 1, second position and say what our function would be returning is the letter C, since that is the value in position 2 of this string. So that's what our function does in summary. It finds the largest item in the list, it finds the position that corresponds to that largest item, and then it returns to us the candidate that that individual voter prefers. So when we jump back to our plurality function and return back to what line 13 is really creating for us, it's giving us a list that has the same length as the number of voters we're considering, and it's a big old list of letters. That's why it's called letters. And the letter is that particular voter's ballot that they would be casting. I'm voting for candidate C, I'm voting for candidate A, I'm voting for candidate G, and so on and so forth. So let's add that in as a comment here, and let's return now to the remainder of the plurality function. So once we've created this list of letters indicating who each voter would have cast their plurality vote for, we're now going to create 2 objects, one called myDictionary and one called reverse. Now you can see from the syntax here that both the myDictionary object and the reverse object are in fact dictionaries. You can tell because they have these squiggly braces declaring them initially as empty dictionaries. And then the loop that we have right here, starting at line 18, is going to add keys and values to each of those dictionaries. What we're going to do is loop through the candidates one by one. Again, this candidates object is referencing that global candidates object coming from what is now line 33 in our code. So we are going to step through the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G in this loop here at line 18. And you can see that all that's happening inside of this loop is that we're populating the dictionary object, my dictionary, and the reverse object. And the only difference between lines 19 and 20 is that the keys for the my dictionary object are letters. They correspond to the values in the candidate string. And the values are numeric. Well, the reverse object is doing, well, the reverse of that. Its keys are going to be numbers, and its values are going to be strings. So what is that number that is the value for the my dictionary object and the key for the reverse object? Well, what it is it's the output of the count method that's associated with the letters list. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the letters list and we're going to count how often that person appears in the list. In other words, how often was that candidate voted for? Each voter gets to cast that one ballot for that one top candidate, and we're going to count up how many of them cast their vote for each one of the candidates. So as an example, if candidate A had received something like 17 first place votes, then my dictionary at something like A would be equal to 17, while exactly the reverse would be true for this object called reverse. Reverse at something like 17 would be equal to A. Now for me, the my dictionary object seems a little bit more intuitive than the reverse object. Once we've created an object, the my dictionary object, that has as its keys each candidate and has as its value how many first place votes they got, once that process is done and we're out of the loop, that brings us to line 23, where what we want to do is figure out what the biggest value in that dictionary is. Who got the most votes? The way we figure that out is we look just at the list of values in the dictionary. That's the mydictionary.values part. And we ask for the largest number in that list with Python's max function. That is the number of votes of the winning candidate. However, that's not what we want to return. What we want to return is the candidate who received that number of votes. And that's where our reverse object really comes in to help us out. What reverse does is it takes in that numerical value of how many votes the candidate got and returns what candidate received that number of votes. So if, for example, 17 were the largest number of first place votes, then whatever is in this biggest thing, if that were 17, we would say, what candidate was it that had that number of votes? And that's what would be returned by this statement on line 24. And that's it. That's the whole body of this plurality function. So when it comes down to it, we'll create this object called winner. We know now that that's going to be a string, since that's the type of object that's being returned to us here at line 24 from the plurality function. So we're going to get a string here, and what that string is going to be is just one of these letters in the candidate's string that corresponds to the winner of the election. At that point, all we have left to do is print that winner to the screen, and that's all there is to the program.